Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. In this world, you will have trouble, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. These words of Jesus, promising that his followers would suffer persecution and trials on his account, echo down through 20 centuries in which they have unquestionably been fulfilled. It was Tertullian who famously said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And whether you agree or not, the church has grown beyond the wildest imagination of Jesus' first disciples. And as Jesus warned, so has persecution. In 1563, historian John Foxe published what would become one of the most widely read and revered books in the English-speaking world, Foxe's Book of Martyrs. That book would undergo centuries of expansions and new editions, chronicling, from a Protestant perspective, the witness of Christians who gave their lives or were persecuted for their faith. Yet, at almost 40 years older than the King James Bible, Foxe's Book of Martyrs is a challenging read, one most Christians today have not tackled. Well, realizing this, a brave pair of authors have set out to update and expand on Foxe's subject matter for modern readers, and to expand the scope of martyrdom to include Catholic and Orthodox Christians who've given their lives in the name of Christ. In the new Book of Christian Martyrs, Johnny Moore and Dr. Jerry Pattengale offer the stories of heroes of the faith from the 1st to the 21st centuries to a modern Christian church that is vastly larger, more global, and by some measures more persecuted than at any time since Christ spoke those haunting, hopeful words. Today, I welcome Dr. Jerry Pattengale to explore this tremendous and inspiring new book. Dr. Pattengale is a professor at Indiana Wesleyan University and holds distinguished posts at Sagamore Institute, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Waverly Abbey College, and several others. He was a founding scholar at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., and wrote a book behind the award-winning TV series called Inexplicable: How Christianity Spread to the Ends of the Earth. Dr. Jerry Pattengale, welcome to Upstream.
Well, it's certainly good to be on your show, and to your colleagues there. I just appreciate all that you're doing. Of course, you have facilities there near the museum that I frequent often, and you certainly are a solid institution. The institution for me is a systematic response to recurring need, and you've certainly found a way to be systematic, Shane, in what you're doing here for hundreds of thousands of people.
I'm honored to hear that. Thank you so much for saying that. There's a high-profile politician in the U.S. right now, and I think he said something that can really get us started off on the right foot. He said, basically, I like people who don't get captured. In essence, he likes winners, not losers. And he got in a lot of trouble for saying that, understandably. But as writers like Tom Holland have helped me to realize over the last few years, this winner worship is actually the historical norm. And yet Christianity is in so many ways a religion built on losers, or people the world would call losers, the people who got captured, starting with the Savior himself. What's up with martyrdom? That's the question I think that should anchor us at the beginning here. How did it become a thing in Christianity that getting killed is praiseworthy and beautiful and in a sense an imitation of our Savior itself?
What a great segue to this important topic. You're wise beyond your years. For those seeing this, Shane, you look like one of my sons. I mean, you look very young. But what a great segue. About being captured, about the term, witness or martyr. I think this side of heaven we won't know for sure. It says in Corinthians, now we see through the glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. But remember this and never forget it. We do see through the glass. We see enough to know the truth. And we know there's a reason for this. We don't fully understand it this side of heaven. And about, you like people that don't get caught. A lot of what he says is tongue-in-cheek, I think, on the political spectrum. But when you're talking about martyrs, starting with Christ in the garden being captured, one of the first, if not the first actual recorded text we have of a martyr is Polycarp. And Polycarp in Turkey, Smyrna, Bishop of Smyrna, he was trying not to be captured, and the Christians were taking him from farm to farm, and the Romans kept coming after him. He's 86 years old, and finally goes, wait, I'm not running anymore. He goes, I'm not hiding out here. I am who I am. I'm a Christian. And the Romans came, the captain, in early second century, the captain's name, fittingly, was Herod. And Polycarp, instead of just still trying to hide, he made a big feast for them, welcomed them in, and gave them a whole feast as they came in. And here's someone in the lineage of the apostles. And Ignatius and Irenaeus were familiar, later Irenaeus. And so you have one of the very first martyr accounts where he finally said, okay, here I am, come get me. So visceral answer is this side of heaven, we won't really know with martyrs. And to be fair to other religions, there are martyrs in every major religion, certainly the Abrahamic religions, if you include all three in the Abrahamic religions, which is a debate I know on it. So there are 1 million Muslims right now in the Middle East in internment camps, probably, they're going to lead to their eventual deaths. Or, excuse me, I think in China, actually in China. And more Christians are dying at the hands of communists today than any other political entity. And so it is so with other religions. So it's not just Christians. There's the 20 martyrs of the Jews that is on an early list. So we all have our martyrs, but in Christianity, and that's what we're speaking of. We can't represent, I'm not here to represent the other religions. All I can say is that from the earliest times of the church, when you became a Christian, it was no surprise. It was a commitment unto sacrifice. It was a commitment of your life. It was a commitment to Christ, not to this earth. And so it shouldn't be a surprise. And we all, Shane, in a sense, when we accept Christ, we accept persecution. I write publicly. Whether I'm good or not is for people to decide. But I know that any one sentence, any one thing I say, I can be in a sense, and in no comparison to these martyrs of this book, but the likenesses, there's the oppression and the outcast and the ostracism. And that word comes from voting. They used to vote on ostraka, which is the Greek for potsherds. And that means you were cast away. And in a sense, today, the persecution of the church is being ostracized from meaningful dialogue, which, as you know, Socrates chose death instead of that. That's not what we're choosing here, but it's an ongoing thing. And I think it's part of being a Christian is being open to the persecution that might come because of that. And I'm saying this, Shane, God has blessed our family. The Museum of the Bible, if you go in there, it's just, it's so magnificent. Those of us who are involved in building that, we walk in there, it's not ours. It's a gathering place for Christians across the world and Jews and anyone who wants to go. And so we are truly blessed. But at the same time, we rub shoulders with people who end up dying in the mission field. So this is not something from the past, which we'll probably talk about later with one of my students being among the martyrs.
I wonder if part of the Christian impulse toward glorifying and highlighting and venerating martyrdom and martyrs is that in Christianity alone, among the world's religions, the death of the founder is seen as theologically as the means of salvation. So, you think back on even the other Abrahamic religions, the death of the founder, as far as I know, there's no salvific sort of significance attached to that event, right? It's not said that the founder had to go to his death or willingly gave up his life or something of that to that effect. But our founder actually is a martyr whom we worship and a martyr whom we believe came back from the grave on the third day as part of accomplishing that salvation. And then he has these cryptic and almost tantalizing, but also scary words in the Gospels where he says, if anyone wants to follow me, he has to take up his cross. Even before he goes to Golgotha, he's promising you're going to have a cross waiting for you, whatever that looks like, metaphorically or for some of the disciples, literally. And so there's this sense that we join our Savior somehow in that work, and that our martyrdom, Christians' martyrdom, which has happened again and again throughout history, you tell the stories, there's something to it beyond just dying for your faith. There's some kind of kinship with Christ himself in that. And I just can't help but have that instinct, even though I can't fully define exactly what's going on there.
Oh, I agree with that. In fact, Christianity is the only religion that has a historic belief in the resurrection of its deity. And so one of the things about martyrdom isn't simply that these people died for their faith, but that they died for their faith and belief in a historic person who walked the face of this earth with many artifacts around to attest to the stories of the New Testament and manuscripts, with the central story that he rose from the grave. So that's why Easter is such a big deal, So Christmas is, but Easter certainly is a big deal. So we believe that Jesus died once, so we don't have to die twice.
Situate my listeners and your readers within church history, if you would. Why a book about martyrdom now? And how did you and Johnny Moore discern this sort of call to write this? What's your specific interest?
Well, that's great. So let me personalize this, first of all, with my own student. So in 2010, Cheryl Beckett was one of the 10 medical missionaries in Afghanistan who was simply out in a village, and they were quite a ways from most of the major centers in Afghanistan. And they were simply helping people with dental and eye issues. And the river had swollen, they couldn't get back over. And the Taliban came and found them, found a Bible in the dash, according to the survivor, the only survivor. He was quoting the Quran, so they let him live. And they lined him up and just shot him one at a time. And Cheryl Beckett was one of those, and she was one of my students. I mean, I taught Sunday school for years here next to campus. So when that news came, can you imagine someone, this beautiful young woman who, there's a picture of her in front of the mountains in Afghanistan. I hope you all see it. And it just is, it just rips you when anyone close to you dies that you love. Well, I called her father, who was a pastor. His name's Charles Beckett. And he said she wrote in her journal, and when she died, in order for him to kind of help understand her a little better, he pored over those journals. And just a couple things here that she wrote. He says, so she wrote in her journal, which has been a spiritual oasis for me. Over and over again, I read this theme, no longer my own. I've been bought by Christ with his own blood. I want to know him better. And then she wrote, I want to die to myself. Back to your earlier vision of being a Christian and someone who was a martyr who found it. Then she asked the question to herself, what does that look like? How do I make that tangible? That is what she devoted her life to, knowing him, but knowing him by sacrificially suffering in order to show him. Wow. I mean, when I walk through Indiana Wesleyan's campus, and I've been privileged with the title they give me, and I write basically for a living now, represent the college that way. But her picture's in our main library, and you walk through. And Shane, especially when I'm alone, I'll stop and salute her picture. I hope that's not sacrilegious, but it stops me in my tracks. In fact, the 7 years it took to write this book, when you ask why this book now, because more Christians have died in the last 100 years than in the history of Christianity. That comes out of the Ethics and Public Policy Center research team. That's not us saying that. But many times in the morning, I rise pretty early every day, probably 3 hours before a lot of people. Part of it is just getting older, and I don't stay up and watch TV usually. And so, but many times, Shane, I have found myself putting my hands up above my keyboard and just asking God to help me, to write the words that capture this. People won't remember this so much as they will the stories. They won't remember who wrote this book. I hope they remember the stories. And so my name, Johnny's name, years from now, I hope this has a long shelf life. I mean, that's really my prayer. The hardest part for me was that after 7 years, it was 270,000 words. And so the editors had to cut quite a bit of it out. So I don't know if you have a copy of it, but it's about 620 pages.
Right here, I understand it was more in the neighborhood of 800 pages at the beginning.
Well, you've done your homework, yeah. So Tyndale House, one of the better publishers, and the only independent major Christian publisher in the world left. And all the proceeds go to foundations and ministries. I mean, they don't keep any profits, and my proceeds are going to Christian needs and scholarships. But there's a scene at the end of Schindler's List that kept coming to mind. But at the end, I think it's Liam Neeson who plays Schindler. And he holds up his pen and he goes, I could have saved another person if I just sold this pen or my car. And he's just, grabbing at his hair, I believe. And that scene really hits me because we all wonder if what we're writing is of value, of eternal consequence. And so I hope that this book is. I mean, all the civilizations that we've studied, all of them have had pogroms or wars or practices where they've killed people. The Mayans that we celebrate sometimes in junior high school curriculum, I mean, they were ruthless, just killing whole groups of people. And you can go down through the list of what people have done to other people. And from the ancient Near East of putting people in buildings when they build them, plastering them, the walls. And if you think that's going to change, and human nature is going to change, you're kidding yourselves. This is where I wish Victor Davis Hanson would speak on that and also on martyrs and the role of martyrs, because he would probably say something like, if everything's true, nothing's true. And I think we need to represent these martyrs. Here's the toughest part, Shane. The toughest part. Johnny Moore sent a team and interviewed all kinds of families that had people martyred in their families. And Johnny's the reason I wanted to write this book now. It became a book I could not write. And God had given me various other contracts, probably the busiest year of my writing career as far as all these books coming out this year. But I could not write this book. You know what Johnny did? Johnny's your age. I mean, he's young. About 10 years ago or so, he raised money, some of his own, and he bought planes or paid for planes to go rescue people from Lebanon who were escaping Iraq. Who does that? Johnny Moore did that. Why? Because God put it on his heart to help his brothers and sisters. And then he reached across to other religions to help them, but mainly he was interested in that and then sent people to interview all these families. And the hardest part was when their stories couldn't be included. Every story that was cut is kind of cut me a little bit. But in order to tell these stories better and to have more impact, we just couldn't tell them all. I don't know if you've seen the original Foxe's Book of Martyrs, but one of the book launches we did, and to have Nettleton there from Voice of the Martyrs, emceeing it, oh, what a joy. And his book was one that I'd highlighted in Christianity Today last month, and it's been 40 days from his journal on the front lines. And so, what's interesting in here is that these modern stories, there's so many of them that we can't really tell them. And many of the stories we have here literally say, and thousands were killed that day. We don't have their names. Foxe wanted their names to be remembered. And so the books got larger and larger. The different editions of Foxe, I mean, you couldn't carry those to school every day, let me tell you. And I was in Cambridge studying those, and we have some in the Museum of the Bible as well. And when we did the book launch with Nettleton, the Remnant Trust from Indianapolis brought two of their copies up. But the second or third edition are big folios. They're huge. You could weightlift with them. And people just kept adding stories, giving Foxe these stories. And I'm reading those for 2 days in Cambridge University Library. I'm fortunate to be a fellow at Tyndall House, Cambridge, with Peter Williams and the group, a powerful, strong group. Those of you who fund Bible study experts, they're wonderful people to support. And I got a call and says, Jerry, the movie Silence is playing at the Cambridge Theater. It just opened. So I went to see it. So I spent 2 days. So Shane, think of yourself poring over this Old English from the time of Queen Mary, 1553 to 1558. So he writes this shortly after there. That's why he attacks Catholicism so much, because his friends were dying at the hands of that. I leave 2 heavy days in the Cambridge University Library reading these books and ones related to them. You have the Martyr's Mirror and other books. I go to see Silence. I don't know if you've seen the movie about the Japanese persecutions of Christians. I walk in, there's myself, one other single person by himself, and a family with young kids. Place is empty. No one wanted to see these tough stories on martyrs. And it's kind of it's a brilliantly done movie. It's just kind of depressing. And as it's not far into the movie, Shane, I smell popcorn wafting through the theater. I hear kids asking their parents for more candy. And on the screen, on the tar pits, literally is the scene of the Christians being martyred. And then later, oh, this gruesome scene where they hang him upside down and they do bloodletting to keep him alive. And it really happened. They're asking again for the popcorn. And I said, Lord, what a contrast. And so why do we tell these stories now? Because we live in a society where people don't want to hear these stories. They look at them either as entertainment or it parallels the graphic novels that are being played out on video games. And these are real men and women, godly men and women. The Stams and other people the Elliots, just wonderful people that went to their deaths, really went to eternal life. And their last hours here were not pleasant.
And that seems like such a great illustration of why a book like this just works. Not only why it's important and timely, but why it works, because the stories that you can draw on from more recent times, right, from the centuries since the original Foxe's Book of Martyrs came out, very much mirror the stories from earlier times. I mean, the stuff that you're talking about with the Catholic Jesuit martyrs in Japan, the stories of the more recent things of Jim Elliot and Nathan Saint, right? These are famous stories that have been told, but they, in many ways, they could be like the next chapter in the stories from the first century, or the persecution under Nero, or the persecution under Diocletian. All of these stories feel like they're a continuation of the Book of Acts, and I guess theologically, you can say that they are, because we're doing the same thing. We're obeying the same Great Commission, and we're taking up the same as a church collectively. And I use the first person plural pronoun there with reverence, because I've never faced life-threatening persecution, but we're doing that same, obeying that same command. And the crosses are still heavy. Sometimes they're still literal, but those stories need to be told, and that connection needs to be made. And I'm not sure that in many Christians' minds, especially in the West, that connection is as strong as it ought to be.
Yeah, speaking of modern martyrs, oh my goodness, I hope everyone reads the history of the Voice of the Martyrs. Rembrandt was buried for 3 years. They buried him underground for 3 years. And they even had the soldiers wear pads on their feet so he wouldn't hear noises. And you know how he survived? He started thinking of sermons that he had preached and knew them from memory, and would every day go through a sermon. And then he would start over after a year. I was convicted about my own memory of Scripture. I used to memorize it pretty regularly, and I kind of lagged. So I started going back, and I just thought, wow. And then if you watch his testimony afterwards, I mean, for every day he would remember a sermon underground by himself. And I thought, wow. I said, I want to be that person. Other modern, Virginia Proden wasn't killed, but they marched someone into her office, put a gun to her head in Romania, and she led the assassin to the Lord. She witnessed to him, and years later, if you buy her book, which I hope you do, Saving My Assassin, it was highlighted in that Christianity Day piece I did. And I've met her.
She's spoken for us at the Wilberforce weekends before.
Oh, so she's like 4'11", yes. And years ago that
my wife is a huge fan.
Oh, well, you know what? I love her and her story. And, do you know what it was that finally turned the West against Romania? Is someone snuck her a piece of toilet paper that the dictator had made from Bibles confiscated from Christians he had either put to death or persecuted. And finally, the West said, that's enough. It was kind of interesting. It wasn't enough. There was killing people. It was over the line when you desecrated the holy book. Toilet paper for those fancy restrooms in the Emperor's Palace. That's how that woman brought it down. But she watched many people go to their graves or disappear. And so we have people around. I had the privilege. The Museum of the Bible, I was sitting in the cafeteria where when you stay there, there's a few places that we eat together. And maybe you've been there, Shane.
Several times.
If not, on behalf of our CEO, Harry Hargrave, and Steve Green and others, love to have you there. It's our guest. Well, anyway, I'm sitting there having lunch, and I just flown in, and I was getting my bearings and getting ready for a meeting, I think with Tyndall House. And there's a Chinese man there, and we're talking, and I realized who it was. It was Watchman Nee's cellmate for 9 years. For 9 years. And here we are having a nice conversation, but as soon as I shifted to Pastor Nee, he got so fired up and so energetic about retelling the story the last day that he saw Watchman Nee alive. And Nee had given him an ink pen. And he in turn donated that to the museum. I think it's the only artifact from an actual incarcerated martyr. And so and you talking about a relic. And I listened to his testimony about in that cell with me or in the same camp. And it's a living testimony to the power of someone being persecuted that God somehow helps to sustain. And it ministered to me. I mean, it was gripping. And so I hope you all have a chance to see that video. And so you have Virginia Proden and Pastor Wu, who's still alive, and yet they've been through this, and it really is just amazing.
Maybe we should back this up a little bit and ask about Foxe himself, because that's the historical touch point of this project. It's an expansion on that. And throughout the book, you've got these great little sections where it's like vintage Foxe, and it's a quotation from the original, right? That kind of gives you the flavor of what's going on here, especially with that particular martyr, that whoever you're dealing with at the moment. But give us his story. What was he up to? What were the project's virtues, and what were its limitations that I think, you talk about modern Christians would like to see updated?
Well, first of all, you're only 100 years after printing press. 1454 is Gutenberg. And so you are about 100 years after. Like I said, Queen Mary went to 1558. And so you have a few hundred Protestants that are brutally put to death. I mean, it's brutal no matter how you do it. And so what he was seeing were some of the most educated men and women being put to death, regardless if they're Protestant or Catholic. And later the Protestants did that to the Catholics. Anyway, we go on and on about the number of people. And so he felt like with the printing press as his aid, he could put them in print here's what his calling was, Shane, to remember them for all posterity, and for people also not to forget the names of the perpetrators, of the persecutors. So it wasn't enough just to remember those who were killed. He said, we're not going to forget your name either. It's sort of like the guy who the Mulligan's named after. He's forever known for a mulligan, for cheating at golf.
Or sort of like the procurator of Judea, who we remember in infamy every time we recite the Apostles' or Nicene Creed.
Yes, that's true. Yes, very good. And so you're stuck with that, And so his calling was twofold. And then he felt incumbent upon including as many of those accounts as he could. And it was hard for him in the end. I think the second edition got better. People debate, there were several editions of Foxe after posthumously, and one came out right as he died. But that was really what he was up to. And so you have someone who's in a changing landscape too, between you have Catholics and you have Protestant and you have Catholic again. And so it's also a lesson. Joanne Lyon, who a lot of people know, she's helped a lot of the disenfranchised around the world, was the first woman general secretary of the Wesleyan Church. But she shared with me one time, both of us have been invited to the White House for meetings. And, she said, Jerry, just remember that we serve the Lord, not a president. And she has served under many presidents. She's been invited in for helping with many of them. And it's hard. It's hard. I'm a conservative. I resonate much better with conservative leaders, oftentimes in spite of a lot of their strengths and weaknesses. And yet the truth is that for whatever reason, God has different parties, in the White House, and we need to realize that Christianity is beyond that. Here's the haunting thing, Shane. When you look at world history, there is not a single civilization that really survived. People try to claim that China did unabated to the present. There were some pretty severe breaks even in Chinese history. And so we need to keep in mind that the church has survived all civilizations in all countries. Yes, it kind of disappeared in Romania and other places for a while, but the church is stronger today. It's in sub-Saharan Africa. It's booming. I'm on a board in Rwanda for African New Life. It's booming in Rwanda. And so there's a lot of great happening, even though even in Rwanda, so many died in the monasteries and other places taking refuge. So I think he was up to something great. But, he has a model. We have a model, not him, because it postdated him. So King James Bible comes out in 1611. You know what's on the title page of the famous King James Bible? You look at it, It's all of the apostles. So there's kind of like a balcony. So you have Aaron and Moses. It's actually by a Catholic lithographer or artist who did this picture. And above the balcony are all of the apostles with the instruments with which they were martyred. And so they're holding, whether it's a saw or a fillet knife or a bludgeoned instrument that they were killed with. And so, in a sense, they were carrying on the tradition, what you talked about, of a founding image of Christ who was martyred. And then they too were in that lineage. John's in there. I don't believe he's listed as a martyr there, but all with their icons. On the bottom of that page also represents this book. The ancient symbol, the church, a lot of people don't know one of the ancient symbols anyway, at the bottom of the page of the 1611 King James Bible. You can Google it. There's all kinds of images. It's a pelican vaulting itself, which in Latin means it's picking the blood from its heart, if you will, and feeding its young. And you'll see the young pelicans out there, and it's feeding it from its chest. And of course, that's an image of Christ with us.
I'm talking today with Dr. Jerry Pattengale, co-author of the new Book of Christian Martyrs. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Upstream listeners, we're excited to announce Colson Center National Conference online for just $49. You can learn from Justin Bailey, Stephen Meyer, Briston Wagoner, and many more speakers from our annual Christian Worldview Conference. And if you use promo code UPSTREAM, you can receive $5 off. That's promo code UPSTREAM. For more information about this on-demand experience, visit colsonconference.org. We're back on Upstream talking with Jerry Pattengale, co-author of the new Book of Christian Martyrs. Dr. Pattengale, I'm recording this not far away from Matanzas Inlet, where Catholics at St. Augustine actually massacred French Calvinists in the early colonial days of America, and they'd settled in La Florida. How do you process the fact, as you referred to a moment ago, that some of the martyrdoms recorded in this book and throughout history were internecine Christian killings, where Catholics were killing Protestants or Protestants were killing Catholics, or some other set of sects?
Well, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question, but it's been asked a couple other places. But by the way, that part of history is tough. In the movie series you referred to earlier, Inexplicable, I insisted we cover that because the Huguenots and it's just the treatment of those who settled first in Florida. It's not a good moment for Christianity. And again, both sides of the Protestants are represented. We are fallen human beings. And this side of heaven, there will always be episodes where people are mistreating people. We try to get it right. We try to do better. And I believe in America for a long time, I think that we really have put in place things that do help protect people and their rights. I think we're doing better at that, but there's kind of been a turn in the last couple of years that has been kind of scary. And I think the Bible has been a mainstay. And so the short answer is the people that carried out those slaughters were wrong. It was sinful. And they murdered people. It wasn't warfare. They simply went and murdered them. When you look at the Crusades, when they attacked Constantinople because of the Venetians, it was murder. They just did it for a contract. There's no way to justify that. And so when you get to the modern political spectrum, there are certain things that people do, and you say, the blood is on your hands. There's just no reason for you to do that. And so whether it's in the Christian circle or not, and so that would be my answer to that. Now, I'm Arminian, and I know that you represent the Calvinist side, but we have the Nicene Creed between us. And by the way, I spent time with the Van Kampen family, who did wonderful work with the scriptorium and so forth. And Mr. Van Kampen would say, Pattengale, you're half Dutch and you ain't much, whenever he disagreed with me, being Armenian. Indiana Wesleyan University, you'd assume that I'm Arminian. But one of the things that's positive about this question, if there could be a positive, is those days are behind us between the branches of Christianity, at least in the West, as far as I know, of killing each other. I shouldn't be surprised if something like that happens. The scary thing is if there's some kind of technologically generated morality code, because ultimately that comes out of human data rhythms that are put in. You've written on this, you've studied this, so you have to send me afterwards the links that you've sent. So yeah, it's the toughest part. I cry. There were many nights I cried. I'm 65, so maybe more prone to this than others. And I'm Armenian, I know, but I cried. I'd read these stories and go, how could people do that? And we made a decision. Johnny Moore and I made a decision to include Catholics who were martyred the same way that they had the Protestants had only included they all died for their faith, even if at times they were killed by other Christians, and sometimes the negligence of other Christians.
A lot of this is, it's kind of difficult to parse when you look back into the era we call Christendom, because there's this strong conflation between political authorities and ecclesiastical authorities, and then Christian identity itself. So with the Crusades, for instance, you've got this just straightforward identification of the West and its nations with Christianity, with Western Christendom, right? With the Pope calls them up and they go to war, and because they're Christian soldiers, right? And we could get into the whole issue of the legitimacy and extent of union between church and state. But when that union is not taken for granted the way it was, I guess it's a lot clearer who are the very sincere Christians out here doing things that Christians oughtn't do, and who are just the conquistadors who sort of wear the cross as a sign of convenience, but are really out for their own financial gain and stuff. You see a lot of that in history.
Yeah, I believe that you should never give people legitimate reason to question your spirituality. And when I was in Oxford recently, I did a chapel at St. Hugh's College last week. And one of the passages was simply of them finding Titus. And they said the brethren or the followers, I think the New Translations, but it's plural in the Greek. I think it's adelphoi in the Greek. In Iconium and Lystra spoke well of him. So what it was is his reputation was solid in more than one place, with more than one person, more than one time, really. When you look at all that happened earlier in the book of Acts, especially. And so I think that in this day and age, we need to do our best to be people like Polycarp, which I mentioned earlier, you mentioned earlier, that have a reputation that people go to. By the way, when he entered the stadium, he heard a voice from heaven, according to the hagiographers. People recorded this. He heard a voice from heaven that says, "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." And so if you're a woman, I say, and play the woman. And that's what we need to do. We need to be tough, and we need to follow through, and we need to turn down things that are simply financial gain. And it's really tough in the writing space. You have already identified yourself probably for life by hosting this broadcast. And what you can do, though, and I believe you do, is you try to be fair, you try to be equitable, not simply condescending or whimsical. That's the best we can do. Much of my writing is in the public space, and many of my books, especially my early books, were in McGraw-Hill and education. And people are wanting a reasoned voice. One of the books I wrote with McGraw-Hill is a purpose-guided student, and in it I show an exercise where you go through world history and major events, whether it's Hitler or whether it's these persecutions, and the students would rate them, because I had to figure out a way to do this without using the Bible so that they could understand what are sound morals in society. And they would do a Likert scale, and they would rate what's noble and what's not. And they would come up with a scale. And in every test I did, and some of the tests we did was 23,000 students, and some of the early work I did on this. And so the students would all self-identify what was acceptable morality. And I get a call from Religion, RE Today, publishes the main magazine for training teachers in the UK. And you can look this up. You can find my article. Unlike AI, or Chat GPT, this is not a hallucination. You could go actually find this. You can find a printed copy that's post-dated. So this is a historic artifact I'm talking about. Well, you might remember there were ISIS brides being taken out of London. I remember when Michelle Obama was doing some good work, and she was there, and there happened to be some ISIS brides taken about that time from about the same area of London. So the Parliament came back to the Religion Education Committee, really through Lambeth Palace. I was fortunate to have a meeting there, and said, you must teach that it is wrong to join ISIS, that ISIS is evil. Could you imagine America doing that? I mean, we're so far removed from being able to do the Likert scale noble causes sometimes. And they called me and asked for that article, and they put it out in front of all the teachers in England for all the schools because they have a 1 credit for religion. And they said, we want you to teach that in your religion classes because they were saying ISIS is evil. And they were correct. That's not, you say, Jerry, that's just your opinion. Well, I think it's also substantiated by fact and any reasonable cataloging of morality in the species that we call humans.
Something you said a moment ago raises the interesting question for me of sorting what's historical in the hagiography from what's sort of legendary. And I know in the writing style, it's very careful and cautious that you and Johnny Moore have approached a lot of these stories with openly admitting or identifying where the disagreement or the uncertainty is. I think back in the early parts of the book where you talk about the persecutions in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries of the church by the Romans, right, by the civil authorities and the emperor. And you openly point out that there's a lot of debate about the extent of some of these, like how far outside of Rome itself did Nero's persecution go, for instance. And so how did you sort on some of those? Because I know a lot of these accounts are just bound up with a lot of legendary or even supernatural things, like Polycarp hearing the voice from heaven before his death.
You know what? First of all, for those of you listening, kudos to you, Shane. I've been fortunate to do a lot of broadcasts and to have someone actually read the book and do well. Janet Parshall and others, they do the same. And so thanks to you for doing that. And I'll tell you how we got around. That's a great question. I'll tell you how we got around this is oftentimes, like in the case of Blandina, we have a whole chapter on women martyrs. I think it's the first to actually just do a whole section on women. And as you're talking, I thought, wow, because I just reread this morning getting ready. We give 3 different accounts of people quoting about what happened to her because they're all slightly different. They all incorporate something else. A lot of these come down through Eusebius, and he, great church historian, he collects them. And if you don't know what happened to Blandina in Lyon, I mean, when they couldn't kill her, they finally put her in a bag and she gets thrown on a bull's horn. I mean, it's just horrible. And they were amazed at how she survived so long. So it was, it's an amazing account. But what we did is we went to 3 different sources and said, look, this is what they say here, and this is what they say here. And we kind of do that already with the Gospels. If you take any class in the Synoptics at any Bible school worth its salt, whether it's Indiana Wesleyan or Calvin or Wheaton, they'll line them up and show you what they're saying and where the differences are. Where they're, when blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side begging, they parse that. Well, where was Jericho at, and how many people were really in the crowd? So there are differences, and so we do the same thing here. We actually line them up. Here's where they are. Here's where they're different. Very good question. Oh, by the way, there's sometimes we say this is very difficult to believe, but this is what's been recorded from early on.
There's one remark you make to the effect of, if we're skeptical about this on the basis that skeptics criticize it, then we have to begin to be skeptical about 90% of history because it comes to us in certain ways. I think that was one of the Roman historians actually talking about the persecution under Nero. And it was just like, well, if we can't believe this non-Christian historian, when he talks about multitudes being killed, a great multitude, something like that, then we can't believe most of history. And we're just sort of stumbling around in the dark. That was a good point.
Yeah, very good. Pliny and others, you read that. Some of these accounts, like St. Catherine just came to mind as well. So if you've been to St. Catherine's in Oxford, you'll see, I think, 4 wheels. And so the Catherine's will comes from her persecution. And so, you have St. Catherine's Monastery becomes named after her. And a few hundred years later, the monks said to have found her bones, and they transplanted them to the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments, allegedly. And there's all kinds of artifacts that kind of speak to some of this. But we had to say, this is out there. And yet this is what history is built on. And that's why, in the Museum of the Bible, we have famous manuscripts from St. Catherine's Monastery, the Codex Climaci Rescriptus. And of course, Tischendorf made statement there. But the reason that will became famous is the writer said that when they, first of all, her story is amazing for a couple of reasons, because she was so smart that when Maxentius called her in and found her to be beautiful and smart and outmaneuvering his orators, I think he brought 40 different people into debater. And so remember, this is a man's world. And so you have Catherine so wowing him, he wanted to marry her, which wasn't really a proposal then. You just take him to be your wife. And she said, no, I'm married to Christ. I have a perpetual virginity that I've committed to. And so he got so frustrated after a while, and he kept allowing people to come in and visit her. And she, according to these accounts, would witness to them. They'd get saved. They'd kill them. More people would come in and they'd kill them. So finally, he said, put her to death. So they took her to the dungeon. Finally, they put her on this wheel. And when you read the account of how she was actually killed, I mean, it says that they put her limbs through the spokes and bludgeoned them with a blunt tool. And while they were doing that, the wheel disintegrated. And so it fell apart. And so that's part of the story. Like, all we know is what people told us. And so part of the miracle is that. And so, and that's why it's called Catherine's will. Some people say cartwheels may have come out of that, since it's a lateral. They used to turn them while they were doing this. But the collapsing of that wheel became famous. Just like back to Polycarp, when they finally stabbed him, because the flames went around him, according to those who wrote about it. When they stabbed him, the place filled with this fragrance. And so the fragrance of Christ took on new meaning in the church. So we don't know. All we know is a lot of people talked about it, and it goes back early. And so there seems to be a kernel of truth, at least, in this. So that's the best I can explain that.
You open up with this astonishing claim that more Christians have died for their faith in the last century than in the prior 19 centuries combined. We see on a regular basis, it's an annual list, the World Watch List by Open Doors, they release, and they corroborate all this kind of ramping up of persecution around the world. What's behind this exactly? And who are the modern Neros and Diocletians? How are more Christians now in danger of their lives or losing their lives than ever before?
Okay, so that's George Weigel, who shared that in one of his books from the Ethics and Public Policy Center in D.C. Some of you know Michael Cromartie and the Faith Angle Forum. Josh Good now heads that up. So this is from pretty good company. It's like David Kinnaman of this, if you go over onto the straight research side of things. And I think it's all a political power struggle. When you look at what's happening in China, which is the main culprit here right now, it's simply totalitarian control. You look at what's happened in any totalitarian government, and it becomes very oppressive, and you have lies. Victor David Hanson once was asked, what do you think about this? It had to do with self-identity, whether you're a man or a woman. And Victor Davis Hanson said, what do I think of? I think of, and again, you have to look up the quote, but he said something like mass death and pestilence and hunger and famine. Because that's what always happens when governments begin policies on lies and perpetuate them. And that's called socialism eventually. And there's not a good record there. And so Johnny Moore, who speaks a lot, he just spoke at David Jeremiah's church on this book. He just spoke at Prestonwood Baptist on this. I believe he's been on Foxe as well.
Quite a spectrum.
And he's quite open about the fact that we always look to the Muslim countries as the main radical Islamic groups in those countries, and the truth is, it's that more are dying in the communist countries. One clarification too, we're talking about some religions of peace, and you can name two or three that people usually say. In our book, you're going to find, you go back in history, these religions of peace slaughtered a lot of Christians. And so it's early in the book. And so I don't want people to be misled on that. But today you have radical sects of those groups, not the mainline groups, really called. So I say the communist countries, and then coups in some of the African countries, been much in the news. Same thing that happened in Rwanda is taking place in some of the other countries right now. So those are all isolated, independent groups around power struggles.
Part of it, obviously, is, too, that Christianity is global in a way that no faith has ever been. So I'm getting this claim from Tim Keller, and he makes it in a couple of places, but it was a compelling claim early on that he made in Reason for God, where he identifies Christianity as the first ever global religion. He said every other religion has adherents scattered hither and yon, but Christianity is the first religion that's actually established strong footholds and presences everywhere in the world. And because of that, Christians are coming into contact with a lot of different political ideologies and members of other religions in numbers that would have staggered the imaginations of the early Christians. We're talking billions of people here and now, and that's gonna allow for billions of opportunities for negative interactions and persecution to take place. So there is a numerical thing, but I wonder if, as we come to close to the end of our time here, I wonder what your sense is, Dr. Pattengale, about the possibility that there's a real upheaval of spiritual attack against the church in our time. That in other words, there may be something going on, and I get among what Paul would call the powers and principalities, right? That is leading to more Christians giving their lives for the faith. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think that's true. I will say, by the way, that Pew Research is actually helpful here. One of the main takeaways from a recent world religion study from Pew is that Christianity is the only major religion with a major presence on every continent. And so that's from Pew, and that's summarized in a major report, I think, one of the major newspapers. And back to the other, I reread Daniel not long ago, and I don't know if you've read Daniel recently, but you talk about a cosmic battle. And when you have a demon over a whole region, you have to call in the archangel. And I'm reading that, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I forgot. This is just out. It's like way out there. It's like an Asimov chronicle.
Yeah, it's people ask you how Heiser pilled are you, and there's another theologian who recently went home to be with the Lord, but I had him on Upstream a while back to talk about his stuff, and I love what he said, that the Bible is so much weirder than you think it is, and you need to re-supernaturalize your worldview because I don't know, somebody once said we struggle not against flesh and blood but against powers and principalities.
Yeah, I think it's. The truth is, I have a very good friend who is a distinguished fellow at Michigan State University. And we were traveling to speak at a conference down south. We did a research paper together. And he's in the sciences, and he was telling me all these ways to explain the miracles and everything. And I turned to him and called him by name. I'll leave his name out here. A great guy, great guy, and helping a lot of people around the world with some health needs. And I said, at what point, if you're a Christian, which he claims to be, do you need a scientific explanation to believe? Because either there was a virgin birth or there wasn't. Either the Red Sea parted or it didn't. Either the oceans covered the world or they didn't. Either Christ died and rose again from the dead, and it wasn't some docetic Gnostic event, which is kind of what's in the Quran, really. He just appeared to die. I said, no, the text that we have that I study, that I've personally held and seen at least 5 early 3rd to 2nd century pieces of the New Testament. I said, those manuscripts attest to a story that people believed by the thousands, millions, and then billions. At what point do you need scientific evidence? It's either a matter of faith. And that takes us back to Daniel. And so I reflected on that conversation as I was rereading Daniel, and I thought, yeah, this really happened. These principalities are really there. They're over the same countries that have Ahura Mazda and Ahura Mazda gods in the famous Behistun inscription. I mean, that's the area where all this happened. And there's already gods there, these winged creatures. And so that's where the story of Daniel and these demons coming over. And I'm going, you're talking about pagan dominance in an area. And there is a spiritual side of this that I can't explain. I go back, to the scripture I shared earlier. We see through the glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. And we know enough. We see enough through the glass to know the truth. I wrote a piece on the events in January and the storming of the Capitol. And I quote one of my former professors on that. If you go to Religion News Service, I'm an author there, and you'll see that article on that.
So here's the last question, and it's one that I guess was forming in my mind as I read the book and read these accounts, because the question always presents itself to me: what would you do, Shane, in this situation? And so the question I want to ask you, Dr. Pattengale, is how do we, as Christians in the West, who aren't threatened on a regular basis by these sorts of persecution, by threats against our lives because we profess Christ, how do we put ourselves in the mindset of those who were willing to give their life for their testimony and prepare for the possibility, however remote, that we will be called on to do that? In other words, how do we become the kind of Christians who won't denounce Christ and who will say, he's been good to me for 80 years. How can I deny him now?
I was haunted. This book took 7 years. So there's many times I thought of that. So it was a great question. I told a crowd one of these book launch events, and I said, I think when they start pulling my fingernails, I don't. It's like I don't know how I would handle this. I've had quadruple bypass, and I've got. And I think I just trust that God would help us. David Jeremiah has a book on this, on preparing for persecution. Erwin Lutzer has a chapter in his book on the Nazis on what does this teach us today. Actually, they were down the list. They didn't quite make the CT article, but I could send my descriptions of those two books. Both are the most help I have found, because what happens, Shane, when you look at what Lutzer, and I don't know if Erwin Lutzer from Moody Church, the voice of Moody, really, a good friend. I love the guy. He does a good Billy Graham illustration too. But what he's saying is that when you look at what happened in Germany, there are steps and there are principles that you see unfolding. And this was the church filled with Bible-believing men and women who simply were hoodwinked, some of them. And I think there's a time, and I've been hoodwinked in the antiquities area. Malcolm Gladwell, if you watch this, one of your most helpful books to me was Talking with Strangers about we default to trust. We trust people. I mean, so it's just the way we're made. God made us to trust people. He also gave the discernment of spirits, and there are people in your churches, I believe, that can help you when you have a heretic coming in or someone that is sowing things that aren't good. I think there are people who have gifts to help discern that. And so for me, I think you need to read literature and have principles and steps to help safeguard it. I think you need to be in prayer, and you also need to lean on elders that have a gift of discernment that can help see that in people, because ultimately it is a matter of deception. Now, when it becomes organized, I said earlier, an institution is a systematic response to a recurring need. There are also systematic responses for reeling evil, so they become machines for the ills of mankind. And whether it's literally a metal, the whole ages are determined on the hardness of metal, and they're made for weapons. So who has the hardest metal ends up winning most of them. And so that's going to keep playing out. And because of the nature of humankind, if you study history, I mean, Wilford McClay has a pretty good history of America. You can find good histories of the world where men have been doing this to one another since Cain and Abel.
That's helpful. I think of another movie. You mentioned Silence a moment ago. I think of a movie that was sort of an unofficial answer to that, it seemed to me, and that was A Hidden Life. I don't know if you saw that one.
No, I did not see that.
Okay. But in A Hidden Life, a Christian faced with persecution by the Nazis, not by the Japanese, finds himself in a situation where he would effectively have to deny his faith and convictions in order to save his life and save the existence of his family. And he is urged in every possible way, through torture and duress, to just give in, right? And he refuses to. And he actually, until the end, unlike in Silence, he actually holds fast, and the Nazis end up killing him. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful movie in so many ways. But to me, the thing I took from it is that he was just an ordinary guy. He wasn't a super saint. He believed, and he was a layman in the church, but the strength was given to him when the moment came. It was a sense of every moment of not denying Christ is a moment of victory. Every moment of not reneging on his convictions was a moment of victory. And you see that with other men and women who did much the same thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer would be a related example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just think of the not over preparing or relying on your own power thing as central.
Well, I first of all, I need to watch the movie. I don't get to a lot of movies, but I'll have to watch that. This is not a book of heroes. This is a book of, for the most part, everyday Christians. I don't know what God's going to call any of you to do. I don't know what's ahead for any of us on the persecution level, and whether it's the Columbine situation where, students ask if she's a Christian. And even though there's a different accounting now as far as who it was, it still was the question asked: do you believe in God? I'm reminded, Augustine. Two things with Augustine, and might be you said we're coming to a close here, so might be a launching point for you in your own studies. And then I would encourage all of you to read 2 Timothy 2:2, where we're supposed to be engaged in responsible dialogue with men and women so they can go therefore and do likewise. And for me, we have 4 sons and we have grandsons and 2 granddaughters, and we want them to go on with an understanding of what the truth is, because they're the ones going to have to live this out in a tougher place. But Augustine fled from the Lord, and he went to Milan, and they were having a debate over who should be the next bishop. And you may know the story. Ambrose stands up, and finally he's a businessman, and he just says, hey, he goes, let's just settle down here. And he tried to bring order, and he did, and people were listening to him, and a little child tugs on his coat and said, you be the bishop. No. And he goes and he does everything possible not to be bishop. He has pagan philosophers over, and he said, look what I've done. They go, and then the church comes back and says, look what we made you do. And he had people of ill repute come over, and they go, look what's happened to you because of us. And finally, he reluctantly said, okay, I'll be bishop. He ended up having a profound influence on Augustine, a profound influence, someone who wasn't seeking the stage, but in a sense was setting the world stage for one of the greatest writers in Christianity. But do you know who else had a profound impact on Augustine? And he cites her story 2 or 3 times as Perpetua.
Well, his mom did, but yeah, Perpetua as well, right?
His mom. I've actually been to her tomb in Ostia.
Wow.
I saw all the remains there. So you may know the Museum of the Bible, we had exhibits in Rome at the Vatican twice for 6 months. And so it made a lot of excursions to these holy sites for me. And so when you have Monica, you're right there, big influence. He's kind of running from her. But yeah, it was actually 2 women. Great point. It was 2 women, Monica and Perpetua, 3 really, and Felicita, her colleague there in the prison. But in Southern Africa, a wealthy woman was asked to recant, and she wouldn't. And her dad was so adamant that she recant, he even pulled his beard out trying to get her to change her mind. The reason we know this is she kept a journal like Cheryl Beckett in the prison. So we know her story. And it's an amazing story. And she was still nursing a newborn. So she's wealthy. Sometimes you just think of these poor Christians. No, there were wealthy people that went to their death too. And Perpetua writes in her journal up until the time that they took her out. And at one point, we don't have time to get all the details here, but if you get the book, whether you get the book or not, you can find her story. At one point, she's knocked down and her hair comes down. It's a sign of mourning to have your hair down as a woman at that point. And you know what she did, Shane? She put her hair back up so that people would know that she was proud to be a Christian, and it was an honor for her to be a Christian. It wasn't a thing of mourning to suffer for her Lord. I just think where will I be if this time comes? I mean, it could in America. I certainly hope not. We still are vastly in the majority of those people who have a faith. But I'm just telling you, we stand on the shoulders of remarkable men and women who are now on streets of gold. And I just trust that all of you find comfort in the stories of those who've come before us.
Praise God for the cloud of witnesses. My guest today has been Dr. Jerry Pattengale, co-author of The New Book of Christian Martyrs. Dr. Pattengale, thank you so much for joining me on Upstream, and thank you and Johnny Moore for writing this just enormous and moving resource for the church. I know it's going to bless a lot of people.
Great to be with you, and thanks for being prepared. Really, it's a compliment and an honor, so thank you.
It was an honor to have you. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and stories from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.